Now is the time to welcome Pascal Gielen.
Thank you, Gielen. Does it work? No. But maybe I can. Okay.
No, it's fine. It's just like you have to switch on.
Okay, that's a good idea.
Yes, now it should work. Let's
Hello.
try.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for inviting us here. What I will do this evening is giving a kind of introduction to the concept of communism, of which Dimit has already said. We have written this book, or made this book. It's a volume with several contributions. I made this together with Nico Dox, a Belgian artist who normally needs to be here, but he's still cooking soup to bring to here. So I expect him every moment. What I will do, what I prepared today is a lecture about how I myself came to the concept of the commons. It is now, I think, 5 or 6 years ago that I arrived there in my own research. And I will tell this story also a little bit because it is very much related to earlier research of myself, in which we introduced the kind of what I call creative or artistic biotop, which I will explain in a second. But this biotop will function also tomorrow in the assembly, which we organize in the afternoon with Giuliano, who's already here, Lara. So it is something you can get in your head somewhere, and that we can use it tomorrow again in this assembly setting. So I hope you also can come tomorrow to this. We will experiment with an assembly, how it functions, etc. But that we will explain tomorrow. So I start a little bit earlier, before the commons, and how I self came to the commons by doing research. And this came up with the research that I've been doing, let's say it like that, already maybe for 20 years, starting with, as a sociologist of art, really looking at the institutional context of how an artwork functions. I asked the questions, for example, for my PhD was, when does art becomes art? How is it selected? How does it function, etc.? And which came more and more the question of how do artists survive? What do they need? How can they develop a sustainable career? That was the entrance of my question. And there's also a general question we are dealing now in Antwerp with the CCQO, which stands for Cultural Commons Quest Office, with an interdisciplinary team of 8 people, me included, with philosophers, economists, cultural policy scientists, art theoricians, etc. And we try to discover in cities how can you make creative labor sustainable on the long run. That's the central question. We ask a lot of artists, a lot of creatives, not only autonomous artists, not only visual artists, also opera singers, also architects, designers, people even in pop music, etc. were questioned in the past about, and we always ask them in a way the same question. The question was, what do you need? What do you need to build up on the long run a sustainable career? And the answer is what we abstracted of it goes like this. In fact, they always answer to this question in a way, I need 4 things. We called it afterwards 4 spheres, 4 spaces, etc., which builds up for me the biotop. When you ask artists what do you need, often they say, I need a studio, I need time, I need private time to make my own living, to make my own work, to be reflexive. That's what we call the domestic space. It's a space of respect where you only, for example, let in your boyfriend or your girlfriend or close friends, family, and you can discuss there your work. But there's also a space of rituals. Every morning your 3 cups of coffee before you start working, where you can listen to the same music again and again before you start, or go into a book or catalog, etc. What is very important here, you have your own time, you decide, and you also can lose yourself in time in the studio when you are constructing things, and it's a space of intimacy and trust with only close friends. So that's the first thing what a lot of artists, or I would say creative workers, mention, that they need such kind of space. The second space is what we call the peers. It's like here when you are with colleagues, professionals, college students, an art school, for example, is mentioned. And social relationships are there also, hopefully, of respect, but also always, it's not a kind of relationship you build up there, it's a relationship what we call evaluation. You are always evaluated when you're in a professional context, even when you go for a beer with your professor after school, you know everything what you say as a common artist can be evaluated. And that's in fact the professional setting or setting in which we work. When you talk with curators, for example, when you talk with critics, etc., you know everything what you say can be evaluated. But that's in fact a very good thing, because here you build up a kind of, based on knowledge, creative mass. Yeah? And this sphere is built up also, it has another time logic, it's social time. It is really about the interaction with each other, which makes the time of, or with each other. Or literally in an art school, for example, is the time shadow, which is a social condition when you go from one class to another, etc. But it's also the place of discussion and negotiation. Classical example I always use is a teacher who comes in the classroom or comes in the collective studio at an art school, and an artist is doing there something, and then the teacher starts criticizing, says, for example, what you are doing here in painting is something what Van Gogh already did 100 years ago, and then the student comes at the moment and he says, no, I'm doing something else. And at that moment you see the discussion starting with knowledge, with canon, etc. Third space, when you want to make a living of your work, you need a market. And we define market very broad. It can be also that you are subsidized. For me, it's just the exchange of, or the shift from your artistic activities, whatever you do, in money that you get, can buy bread, etc. So this is another sphere you need. Relationships are, again, totally different in this sphere. It's based on, not on evaluating, but competition. Even when you are in a subsidizing system, you know, as an artist, when you get the subsidizing, maybe another artist doesn't get the subsidizing. Swamp. Okay, so competition is here in interesting quality of the market is that you learn to quantify yourself. You learn to count. You learn to count how much things cost. You learn to count how long it takes for the deadline for the exhibition, etc. So you learn to quantify your own qualities. But time is something else here. Time is money. You learn also to count how much it costs to live, but also how much it costs to make your work. And it's all about trade exchange. I think the purest form, I think, of a market system in the art system is the auction. You can phone anonymous and say, I bid and I give this kind of money and you get the artwork. There's no other exchange necessary. You don't need to know anything about art history, you don't need to know the artist, just money counts. It's the same as you buy a ticket for a theater performance, etc. The only thing is you don't have to argue why you buy this ticket. You only buy it and give some money. So that's the exchange. So market makes also free. It's very important. You only have to give the money. That's the only thing. The last, civil space, is where I say that art can become culture. That means where it can get broader civil support, where people can say, yes, this artist, Michelangelo Pistoletto, for example, is our Italian artist. Then it becomes part of a culture or collective in general. So this is the civil space. It works not with competition but representation. You represent a culture. In general, you stand for something. I heard Marco saying in the former lecture, Ai Weiwei is not a Chinese artist. It's this discussion. What is happening here? And the time is again quite different than the money time. The time is the embedding time. It means the time that you get embedded in a culture, and that your art, even when it's very specific and very idiosyncratic, that it becomes shared by a broader support. And also, maybe also important, not only art experts, which is very much the case in the peers. Maybe a public museum could be such a place. But anyway, what is important is that you can balance, and you need to find a balance also as an artist on the long run between those four spheres. That's the most important thing what I want to say about it. So when you only, for example, we interviewed quite famous artists like in Belgium, Luc Tuymans, for example, in the Netherlands, Marlene Dumas. But especially, for example, Luc Tuymans very much complains that he always needs to be nowadays, almost for 10 years now, only in the market and in the civil space. And he really wants to go back to a domestic space or peers. And it's very interesting what he said. He said it's awful to be 10 years successful, because when you're 10 years successful as an artist, you are more and more only surrounded by people who want something of you. Collectors, of course, but also curators, museum directors, etc. And what he said, they give you the wrong critique. They give you completely a biased critique, which is always related to what they want of you. So you get, in a way, close of the peers at a certain moment, which is very much necessary. So this balancing is very important in it, but also the other way around. When you only stay in the domestic sphere, you are maybe busy with creative therapy or something like that. You're not a professional artist. So those four spheres are important to balance in. A last thing, this is what a lot of artists still nowadays, when we interview them, have in their heads. I need those four. And we could say also, and we can discuss this, until the 70s, 1970s, 1980s, this was also institutionally protected. You had, for example, the domestic sphere, the institution, family, who protected this domestic sphere. Or you have the institution, museum in the civil sphere, who protected in a collective institutional way this sphere. Or the art school, the academy, classical in the peers. And there is something happening with these institutions nowadays, and especially with this institutional defense of it. And this makes me going more and more to the peers. But what is happening on a, let's say, this is what a lot of artists see on the micro level, what they experience individually. But on the macro level, you see enormous shifts, and you could foresee this already. The market is becoming more and more important, is taking things over in other spheres. We see this, for example, on the European level with the creative industry policy, the shift from cultural policy to creative policy, Creative Europe, etc., where you see, in fact, more and more that this sphere is what we call already in the 70s maybe commercialized or something like that. But what for me is much more interesting is that a very important, a very important quality of the market, learning to quantify, is imported also in these other spheres, and then it becomes problematic. So you learn, for example, in an art school already nowadays to quantify yourself. Even before you start thinking about your own, or before you are creative. For example, I worked at an art school where the students get creative industries courses and cultural management. And the first course, the teacher said to the students, it was a famous in the Netherlands Hock Academy. He mentioned to the artists that when you want to make today a successful pop song, 4.5 minutes, no longer. So this is limiting to the market, this making measurements, learning to count. You see this also, especially in the domestic sphere, when you talk with, when you interview, for example, architects, when they start talking about design programs. Design programs calculate already before you start being creative, the risk of your building, etc. So learning to quantify it, cultural industries, more and more museums, of course, need to count their public, and they also, in a strategic way, decide which exhibition they do to calculate how many public they can get in. So you see a kind of quantification of those spheres nowadays. And the effect is for me very interesting. It has a kind of interesting, for me, feedback on the market itself. And it interrupts the market, the classical free market, how it works. For example, I see with my children at home, they start to download things illegally, but also people start to play, manipulate things, etc. You get piracy. Piracy is a problematic thing for a market to function. Second thing, creative industries. Very interesting thing is when you say to all the students you need to make only pop songs of 3.5 minutes, you get homogenization, standardization. Or you get the effect that we have nowadays only, I think, 3 majors in pop music who decide what music is distributed. So you get homogenization. You get also in the system what we've called or mentioned competitive isomorphism. That means that more and more people are in competition with each other, and what they do is they want to distinct of each other, because I want to do something else than you in it, but in fact they are looking to each other, they are mirroring each other, and you get sameness by that people copy each other in this system. And the last one, when you get cultural industries, as a feedback in the market system itself, you get monopolies. You know probably the story. So Facebook, for example, can only function in an economical sense when it has a monopoly, when everybody uses it. That's a completely different business model, a completely different way of dealing in the market. So this is the moment in which we are living, I think. This for me explains also very well the creative banking, 2008 financial crisis, etc. This is the situation in which we are in, and this is also for a lot of artists a very hybrid situation. Sometimes they don't know if they are functioning still at home or are they in the market when they are merely with a collector, curator at home in the studio. So it is a kind of very hybrid sphere. And we asked also artists on the question, sorry, I have eaten too much of this thing. The question, what do you need? Well, they said, or one of the answers is we need more freedom. And here the commons comes in. We need more freedom. We need also the possibilities to use things again for free, to inspire us, for example. And there is, again, where the commons come in. For example, we need to use, or it's important for us to have such a thing like Wikipedia, shared knowledge at home. But also in an art school, it's very important nowadays to discuss our own position as an artist. And that's what I call politics. It's really thinking about your own position in society and also to learn to think or to discuss at least alternatives. For example, now in art schools, a lot of artists have said that you need to become a cultural entrepreneur or an artistic entrepreneur. What does it mean to be an entrepreneur? What is the definition of entrepreneur? And what are the consequences when you behave as an entrepreneur? Are there other models? That's for me a political discussion which is very much necessary. And in the market itself, we see things developing already a long time, like the logo standing here of like Creative Commons, is trying to make free things for free again in the market system itself, under certain conditions, etc. But here came for the first time in my own research the commons in my research. That's where it started. So now I jump to, let's say, almost 15 years later in the research and come to the commons and also to the content of the book which I've made with Nico. So commons, what it is about. Here you see a picture of an assembly in Naples and the cultural organization Asilo. I give it immediately as an example because it let you feel completely immediately what it can mean. For example, people here are deciding together what will be the program of the building or the stage or the venue for the coming months. Who can use rehearsal rooms, who not, and which time channels, etc. They all decide together. And that's a very important, I think, very important principle of commons, which I come later on back to. What we try to do in the book is also maybe to start there. Nowadays, commons is popping up everywhere. It's becoming very fashionable. You see it coming up everywhere, and it's also that the thing what we try to criticize in the book. We try to analyze also where it comes from. It is used by left and right. This concept. I think the first political conference in Belgium was by the Liberal Party about commons, what they organized. And the whole idea of commons, for example, also an idea which is related to the commons of general income for everybody, was launched in Belgium by the richest man of Belgium. With this political party, Libertarian Party. So it is claimed by everybody, this concept. It has also roots in Catholic thinking, community, the communion, to go to the communion. So it can be claimed by a lot of things, but it is popping up nowadays enormously, can be used, abused by a lot. So that's why we try in the book to at least to comment this and try to find out where it comes from. And we do this quite speculative by saying, in fact, the commons, or communism, as the book is called, could be the next ideology after neoliberalism. But what are the consequences? when you think like that. So the whole book is built up with a triology or a triangle. In the triangle, it's related to aesthetics, ideology, and the commons. And we try to connect this in this book. First of all, I give a very brief and blunt definition of commons. What is commons about? As a starting point, there are a lot of discussions about this, but commons is about sharing and governing material and immaterial resources. And sharing under certain conditions. Some people can share and others not. There are borders. But that comes later into for me. Second very important thing is aesthetics, how we define aesthetics. We use a very maybe romantic definition of Baumgarten. It's the art of thinking beautifully. But it's really the art of thinking beautifully. In that sense, it's thinking about beyond the horizon. It is thinking about how the world and life could be. So it's also utopic thinking. It is thinking the world beautiful, in a sense. So it makes you also longing for something in this sublime or something else, sublime society, good society, etc. So aesthetics is that, and aesthetics is also relate to a definition you all probably know of Rancière, is also giving form to. And for us, related to society, it means giving form to living together, giving form to society. What's then ideology in it? I built here on a whole tradition in classical critical theory and post-Marxist tradition, but we shift this or we build further on it, but we shift the whole idea. Classical definition or characteristic of ideology is that it's false consciousness. An ideology is that people let you believe something what is not true. The whole thing is already from Gramsci, Laclau, Mouffe, and then Zizek is. They say there is also. It starts already with Georgi Lucas. But anyway, they say there is also something positive in ideology. And it ends up there with Zizek, who says it's not a matter of false or fact. It is what is a good false belief and what is a wrong false belief in it. So you can build up, ideologies are built up on fiction. So also aesthetics, they are built up on fiction, and in fact, by belief systems, you realize also things which become facts. So there is a kind of very strange mixture between fact and fiction. So you believe in something things, and ideology is also a make-believe. Or what we say in sociology, classical, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You act like that, and then the world becomes like that. So it is also a maker of reality. This is for me a very important thing in ideology. So, and there are then good ideologies and bad ideologies. You can believe in the wrong things, or you can believe in good things. I don't decide what are good things and bad things, that's something you decide, and what ideologies do. But that's what an ideology is doing. It's a make-believer in it. But it's also a thing which makes reality in general. And that's also what we play in the book with imagination and the real. What is then the real? And we build this up on classical comes. I took it from Zizek, but he takes it, of course, from Lacan. What is the real? The real is something you never can point at. The real is something what is under the symbolic order, says Lacan. That means there are no signifiers to signify the real. It is, for example, when you fall in love. You cannot explain why you fall on this man or this girl in love. It is this kind of feeling. It is when you decide to appoint somebody based on a talk where is always a kind of visceral relationship. You cannot touch this. You know it functions, it is there, but you never can point at it what it actually is. Some people try to exclude this in the decision making, but it always plays a role. And this is something what's beneath the symbolic order, which is real, which has an influence, and but which you can never define, never explain. There are 1,000 poems written about love. You never touch the love itself in it, or neurological studies, etc. So this is for us very important, this notion of the real. But every ideology is built on it. And exactly the ideology of communism is built on a specific feeling, which is nowadays more and more lacking, or we feel the lack of this feeling. And this is the feeling of being together, sociability. So the social is a very important layer under communism, feeling that we need, for example, more solidarity with each other. That the market is not everything. That's not only about the economy, but also about shared relationships, etc. So this social is the main, I think, the main layer, or is the real of the ideology of the commons. What do I mean by this? Also, we cannot define the social. The social is not you and me, the social is in between. But what is in between? And this in between is something you never can catch. What happens between people in between? And that's the real, the layer on which communism as an ideology is building. And that's also why so many people nowadays, also from the conservative right, are so hungry for the social again. They see this, in a way, forced to be suppressed in a kind of economical neoliberal system, which works only with abstraction of social relationships and not with what we call assemblage of social relationships. So, but the social as the real is the base in which we define, and that makes, of course, this triangle what we call this ideology of communism. We say also in the book, we know it's an ideology, but we believe. So we are ideologists. And that's, I think, the twist we make. I think a lot of people defend nowadays the commons and being busy again with the commons, but they don't agree with the statement that they are also ideologists by saying this. He's saying you do. You are also a believer in the system and you recommend it to others. I jump now to some more precise definitions of what commons is, or how we also look at it in our research, discussions which are going around the commons also. And I make a distinction between commons and cultural commons. It's, by the way, a slide which I made with colleague Hanka about, we had to give a lecture about cultural policy and cultural policy makers also, and their question was, what is then a cultural policy based on commons? That's why I made the distinction, what is commons and how can you translate it to culture. First of all, based on Neger and Hart's book Commonwealth, we define commons as a common pool resource of material and immaterial sources. I come later to this when I jump to culture, what this can exactly mean, exactly immaterial sources. But for me it's very important, there's also definition of Ostrom, Governing the Commons, classical book, but also even De Angelis used it in a way like that. It says there needs always be sources you share and you want to use to make a living, to be creative, etc. There can be a lot of different things, but that's the first thing. Second thing, and that's here DeAngelis comes and he says, yes, but commons as such does not exist. There's not a kind of ontological thing which is called commons. There is no ontology of the commons. The commons is made in a social system. It's made, again, in social relationships. But also a free market is made in social relationships. That's the base on which a free market is made. It's only another kind of social relationship. So you need a system of people who share and manage also those common pool resources and decide to do this, which he calls the commoners, people who taking care of this, like those people in Asilo in the circle. Next step, also DeAngelis says, yes, but you need more. It's also about commoning. That means the whole thinking and also organizing the whole process of sharing things together. And this is a social process which also looks at how do we produce things, but also how can we reproduce the commons. And what came up very specific in our research, I think, at least for me, it was important to discover when we made a research team for the culture, when I made a research team for the Cultural Commons Quest Office. After a year working, I experienced that I missed a specific discipline in our research team, and that's a lawyer. Somebody who knows the laws, because when you discuss about commons, you are always in a very gray zone. There are a lot of market regulations, and for example, ownership is regulated, contract relationships is regulated by law, but there are a lot of organizations of the commons which have no legal status. So law is very important, and this has to do with jurisdiction, has to do with commoning processes, making things also for others available, and it's also very important. You can only make things for others available, and so develop the process of commoning by making regulations that everybody can share. And this is a very important step. And the last thing I said already, I think enough about it, it's you need a belief system. You need people say, I believe, I go for it. I put my energy in it. And this is the belief, not anymore, like in neoliberal system, belief in a free market and the invisible hand. No, this is the belief in what we say, the social, as the base on which society and relations are built, but also as the base whereon economy is built in general. When you translate this to culture, and here we are totally in the book of Nick and Hart, they say what is commonwealth? It's not only material culture, it's not only nature, it is also language, codes, affects, and we add to it this culture, it is shared values, it are traditions you get for free. So a lot of things are already common. We share it every day, but we don't define it as common. This is for me a very important thing, and can be also, like here, Asilo in Napoli, infrastructures which you share to use. Commoners are, let's say, cultural actors. We define this very broad. What is a cultural actor? Can be also a teacher, for example. It is everybody who mediates in giving meaning to life or giving meaning to anything. So it is a mediator in signification processes. And that's also our definition of culture. What is culture? Broad anthropological definition. Culture is a huge meaning-giving machine or something like that. It is a buzzword. You can take meanings and signify yourself or signify the society in which you're living. And everybody who's dealing with this meaning-giving is a cultural actor, and shares also, is busy with language, with codes, can be theater codes, but can be also subcultural codes, etc. It is mediated in this, is a commoner in this case. And commoning, we saw it already, there are kind of strategies, call it, to organize the commons, and we will experience this, hopefully, good tomorrow afternoon. For example, commoning processes are developed by assembly, where in the best way everybody has a say. But also processes of co-creation. I'm working also with, for example, a PhD artist who tries to dissolve her own authorship. Is this possible? Is it really possible to be an author of an artwork without being an author of it? That's the whole question when you share things. But this is a very complicated thing. Also, back when you talk about law and legislation. I've met in a research seminar once 2 artists who want to make together 1 PhD. It's impossible. There's no jurisdiction which makes it possible to make with 2 persons 1 PhD. At least not in Swiss, but also not in Europe, etc. So this whole idea needs to be rethink about when you want to be busy with common practices. And that's on statement what we made in it. What is then very important in communism as an ideology? It is in fact the inverse of classical or even cliché thinking about Marx. It's not the economy or labor relationships which are the base, but it is cultural is the base. In Marx, the superstructure is culture, is law, for example, is politics, and the base is our economical relationship. What communism does is twisting this, and making the inverse of it, saying, yes, when culture is giving meaning, is the basic action of giving meaning to yourself, also searching meaning about what your life is about in a society, and giving meaning to society, then is this the base on which we all stand. I don't say culture is a good or a bad thing, it can be good or can be bad, but that's the basic action what it does. So it is also giving meaning to trade relationships, giving meaning to economy, giving meaning to politics. It's a basic action what people are standing for. And I think there is communism as an ideology in a way convinced of in this sense. How does this look in aesthetics? I give another example of somebody is also invited for the workshops tomorrow and also for the book launch. This is the work of Risetas Urbanas in Spain, and they will also, Santiago Kirugala will give on Thursday morning also a workshop about this work, but I only want to show this to point and to give some characteristics of the aesthetics of commoning art. First of all, for me it's very interesting where this sculpture, I like this sculpture very much, it's a beautiful sculpture for me, but we can discuss taste of course. But it is hanging there because they found it out that there is no regulation, at least not in Spain, but the claim is that it even is never nowhere in Europe, that you can, which says, there's no regulation which says what you can do between the roots of a tree and the leaf of a tree. So police can look at it, but they can say nothing. There is no regulation. So it's what Santiago also calls for it's an illegal space. It's not defined yet, but what is it? It's in fact a house for the homeless. They can sleep there, and the police again can stand there, look at it, but they can't say nothing. So they made a sculpture, but it's for me still is a beautiful sculpture, but it has also a function. For homeless people. And so a lot of common aesthetics
for me starts there. It's built on what I call civil space. And that's another book, The Art of Civil Action, where we try to explain what is this exactly about the civil space. But I think it's important to mention, because I think a lot of commoning practices start from the civil space. And what is the civil space? The civil space is for me not civic space. I define civic, I know this distinction only works in English, but even then there is a kind of merging of those two, or mixture of those two. Civic stands for me what government regulates. For example, a library system, or teaching, education is regulated in most of the nation states. Civil means that people say, I need something, and we organize ourselves. For example, we need a school here, and we build it. But that's, this action is not decided yet. That means it's not known, those people who build those schools don't know if the government will allow that they build it, maybe even regulate it later on, or not. So this is a tricky thing. That's a legal zone. So it's not illegal, but it is also not legal. It's in between. It's also not public civil space. Public means a public space, and that's for me a very important distinction. Certainly going further on the tradition of thinking about public space like Herbert Marcuse did. Public space means for me where you can say what you want. It's a space of discussion, argumentation, so it can be media, it can be square, it can be a blog, etc. But for me, I distinct it because it's more about talking. It's discursive. Or it can be critical art in a museum. Right? So it's discursive, it's artistic, it is, it stays in the discursive sphere. For me, civil means when you really do things. You build the school at a certain moment, or you construct a newspaper and the editorial board of it. At that moment, you do a civil action. Of course, they are related. Public space is the whole space of ideas. You can get ideas like great ideas like democracy, and then the civil spaces you need to organize it, and together they make praxis. But then it comes, and then the commons comes back in. When you have built a school, and maybe even the government has allowed it that there is a school, you always have the discussion who can have the seats. There are only 25 seats in the classroom. Who can come in and who not? So the whole discussion starts then, who has access? And that's for me the commons, is the whole regulation of access to a civil service. People build up, even sometimes the government takes over, etc. This is where the commons or discussion for the commons comes in. But again, where it starts is always in this gray zone between what I call creativity and criminality. It is not criminal, but it is at the doorstep of legality or at the doorstep of illegality. That things are happening. Again, because a government has not decided yet what this action means and how they will deal with it. So a lot of, when we talk about commoning art, is for me in this gray zone. It is trying to develop a new space, regulated even maybe, without knowing if it is allowed in general. Almost last slide. I want to go a little bit further than what is this communism about, and especially by pointing at some misunderstandings about what communism or commons in general is about. First one thing I said already, and that's for me the huge distinction between communism and communism with the O. Also communism, in fact, takes as a base, as a substructure of society, economy, or production relationships in it. And in fact, it's very strange, but it shares it with this other ideology, neoliberalism, which also says, in fact,
the market or economy is the base of our society. I think communism shifts this. That's what I said. This is the universal, says culture is the substructure, what I mentioned already before. But what is then commons? Commons is not just, because there was also a lot of mistake about this, commons is just like, yeah, you can get free things, free beer, and that's common. We share a beer and everything can take it for free. No, it's not. It's always under certain conditions. And one of the most important conditions is that you do, again, something with this commons and you invest also back in this commons. This is very important, for me, characteristic of it. So it is like free speech. It means you can use for free the words we get in our tradition, etc., but only on the condition that you use them again and give something back to it. Another thing, and that's for me a very important thing, I think, is it is something completely different than a community. A colleague of mine, my former supervisor, once said in a lecture about the commons, you never can live in the commons. It's impossible, it's awful to live in the commons, because the commons is not a community which tries to live with each other in a nice way. No, they share something which they want to produce and want to use, and there's always discussion about it, like these gardens in the back, for example. So it's always about dissent, it's always agonistic, it's always about discussing about a main source. So it's very important, it's a beautiful book, what I've just read a month ago of Jeremy Gilbert's called Common Ground, and he says also the main difference between commons and community, for example, is that commons is not identity based. It's not about sharing an identity. No, commons is about sharing a good and dealing with a good. And there can be a lot of identities who try to share this and need this thing. And there will be a lot of fights also about this. And this is for me a very important difference, I think, to make. But commons also, in this agonistic sharing of things and discussing about things, also the circle of the assembly is about discussing, fighting about things, of course makes a kind of dynamics in the culture and makes culture also in general. So, maybe last thing, common is not about, I mentioned already, a static thing or an ontology. It needs to be performed again and again and again. You do commons. It does not exist, you do it. You do it in making regulations, in organizing yourself, etc. But that means also when you come as a common, you are always confronted with other opinions, or other ideas about sharing those goods. So this means also your identity is always confronted with other identities in it, and which makes also that you have to rethink again your position endlessly in it. Makes it also very tiresome sometimes and very hard to communicate or to make decisions, for example. Then, last thing what I want to do is to point at some threats for the commons. And some of them are very well known because there is a lot of there are made a lot of studies about it and written books about it. And the very traditional one is we call this external threats because they come from the outside. First one is the classical one, 15th century, 16th century, the enclosure of the commons, get privatized. That's the first one. That's well known, but a very important one nowadays, I think, is an external threat is that neoliberal government says, oh, you can organize yourself, perfect, do it. We have no responsibility. This is my millionaire in Belgium who says this. Just do it yourself. You don't need social security anymore. You can organize it yourself. We see it, you get it. So this is a very important threat, I think, also.
And classical one again is you always need to deal with free riders, people who come in the garden, take the vegetables and say bye-bye, I sell it on the market or something like that. You need to deal with them, so you need regulation. But for me, much more interesting is, at this moment at least, are the internal threats. Incoming behavior or incoming practices are also internal problems. Like, for example, nepotism. Friendships, of course, rise in the commons, but yeah, what happens there is also the whole idea of I scratch your back and you scratch my back. And that you defend others before not in the common, not anymore on common ground. Fraud happens a lot, but also something remarkable, and I know this picture is in black and white, but commons is often a thing, I think, of the white middle class. It's popping up also nowadays, definitely by the decrease or the threat of the middle class, the creative class, also, etc. But also to be good in using the tools of commoning, like, for example, assembly. You need to have certain skills. You need to have the possibility to argue and to talk. So you need to have a certain schooling, which also can be maybe an internal enclosure of the commons by a certain group of white middle class people. And the last one is for me very important, I think also, which the commons or commoning practices need to deal with, is social control. When the government doesn't give the regulations anymore and you stand for your autonomy, you want self-regulation, of course you need to control each other. Commoners need to control each other. We know certainly from, let's say, pre-modern times what this can mean when you live in small communities, how social control can be very claustrophobic. But we see now, nowadays also in highly digital times where people can control each other in a very, I call it totalitarian way, but it is decentralized, it is not centralized, it is a claustrophobic way to have social control. I give one example. It's for me a beautiful organization in the Netherlands. It's called Commonici, and they organize for free health security. But also security even for when your phone gets broken, etc. You can get it. How it functions, you can look up Commonici on the internet and you see how they function. But what is interesting is that they give an insurance for free, and how they do this, that you can save money for yourself, and you can say, when you are part of it, of this community, you can say, okay, I think this person now needs, because she already asked it, has an illness, my money, I give it, but there is a guaranteed function that you get it back. So it's a very interesting thing. First of all, this is an external threat, because what they are very afraid of is that private insurance companies, what you are doing there is illegal at this moment. But there is much more, I think, an internal threat is, of course, when you want to give or you want to have an alternative income by this insurance, you have to share your disease with the others, and you have to give up your private life for a part in this shared group. So social control becomes something very tricky in this commoning practices. Anyway, that's it. My son was falling. Okay. When there are questions, discussions, please let me know.
I was wondering about, if you comment about your governance in the commons, or maybe you refer to it maybe as regulation or something, how the commons organizes itself. And I was confused whether you said that the commons was to do the sharing of goods or the sharing of the good. it's an interesting distinction, right? Is it about a social good or is it about a resource? And therefore, is it about social relationship or is it about economics? Or a form of a certain economic relationship?
I think to give an easy answer or a simple answer is everything. It can be everything. It's based on how you organize it. So it can indeed be codes. It can be indeed economical goods. It can be purely symbolic things you share. It can be political thoughts. So it can be everything. It is only how you organize it which defines what is in common.
Okay, well, I guess I'm confused about how that can be based around not an economic substructure, but a cultural substructure, as you say, right? But nonetheless, one which is not formed around identity and around. It seems like any way you cut this, you have to end up with a kind of economic relationship between people, and looking at the individuals with a stake in the game that everyone participates in, and how we relate that. And I was confused about this distinction whether it's not economic but cultural. Because
I know, but it is economic. But maybe the tricky thing is what I say: economy is culture. So it is a system of meaning giving to a certain kind of trade relationships, for example, sharing, production, etc. And you can. That's why I say it's the base. You can give this meaning in a different way, in different ways. And so certainly it's about economy. Yeah, certainly.
Well, just sorry if I could just add one thing. I totally agree, but then in that case, as we see in like so many kind of cooperativism kind of situations and the history of communalism and all of those things, how do you end up with a structure which does not ultimately govern for a kind of certain atomized individual within this shared collectivity where like everyone is equal, but nonetheless we end up with this kind of the libertarian version of decentralization where like everyone is free to and then operate in the same space, but ultimately you're talking about a form of individualism rather than a shared kind of cultural, social bond.
I don't know, because I think at least as you the tools of governance which are used, like assembly, etc., the outcome is, I think, certainly not when it functions well, but we will experience this tomorrow, that the outcome will not be an individual outcome. I mean by that one idea of one person will be the one thing. It can be, but the outcome can be also completely different. And I think this is the principle that you, in fact, at least de-individualize the process of decision making, but also the outcome of it. But you can help much more in this as an expert than I. But I think this is for me very important. So again, what is functioning there is again the very unclear thing, the in between, and what happens there in between. And I have this something in very bureaucratic meetings also that we start with that I start also with an agenda. I say I want to have this. That's my target in the meeting, and I want to get it there. And after the meeting, the outcome is something completely different. But I also agree. And this is for me a kind of there happens something in between, which makes you convinced or something like that. Etc. But the outcome is for me not individual anymore. It's a collective outcome.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I don't understand.
Okay, so it's a rather methodological question, because I understood from the presentation that you build out a position and let's say a theoretical position about this topic, commons, which communism that you would say that is in fashion, and you certainly wanted to have a kind of critical position about this, so you have done it in the book. And then you sort of mentioned the sources of your thinking and on which you are basing your political construction, let's say, the Angelis, maybe Ostrom, people from very different backgrounds, from different positions as well. But at the end, I think in the conclusion, when you are looking at a more practical way of defining threats, I would say at the end, you do not mention anymore where from do you take this.
Where from do you?
What is the, let's say, epistemological basis of this list that you are putting there? Are there, where from do you know?
Okay, yeah. I go back to that.
Have you done field work or, are particular cases? Because I think there is a contradiction somehow when you speak about the fact that the commons are a process, so to say, they are unique to this particular community. They are always, in the process of evolving and let's say, they depend on whoever is there and what they are doing. But at the same time, here when you speak about threats, there are very particular type of threats that I think address particular type of commons that you have in mind, probably, that are certainly located in Europe or, I do not see the threat of the middle class civilization in a common in Amazonia or in a different context. And then I think again some are physical, some are rural, probably others are immaterial, there are new commons that are very much coming from the technological field and so on. So I think for me it's a little bit of a generalization, and I'm curious about your
Yeah, sure. Some are really, we get out of critique on, for example, Ostrom, etc. already. For example, I think our starting point, she has the 7 or 8 design concepts of what is commons and how can it function, how can you design also an organization or an institution of the commons. And the first one is that you, she says, one of the conditions to have a good functioning commons is that you in fact have a kind of, that you have borders and that you have a kind of homogeneous group. The critique on that is already, okay, so it's not so open. It's only for a community who shares in it. So a part of those critiques or threats, I call threats, are things we need to deal with, come out of theory and critique out on theory. But Ostrom, I find Ostrom not so theoretical. For me, Ostrom is really empirical research about what she...
It's her friend, I think, that she did extensive empirical research to draw out this conclusion, and then this is why we believe her.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and others are things we are discovering now. At the moment when we arrived at Asilo, we saw this middle class sitting there around the table and say, okay, so you experience it literally with Common Easy. We talked with, we invited the economist to organize this insurance thing, and it is something where he came up himself. So a lot of things are just by doing our own research, experiencing this kind of threats. And again, it's for me, it's not a critique, it are threats.
we have to deal with and have to think about it on the long run. So partly are based really on theory, analysis, and part of our own research.
Do you think there could be more than this?
Yeah,
The one that
probably,
Mhm.
sure.
And
Yeah.
how do we find out which are these others that are missing on your list?
I don't know. I think by I don't know. First of all, you can do classical research. You can do participating observation. That's the classical tools you can use. We also use. You could do data analysis. You could do a lot of in-depth interviews. How things are constructed. For example, what Hanka is doing with Recetas Urbanas, a case in Antwerp. They made a work, and she's interviewing all the people who are involved, who are against it. For us, it's this project of Recetas, which still stays for me very interesting collective, but in a way there it maybe failed. Why? So that's how we try to find out. So that are the classical tools. But one tool which I want to experiment with, and I hope so tomorrow will be the starting point, is my question is, can be an assembly itself be a research tool? Can you immediately put in your research objects in it and give them a voice, and that there comes in this kind of assembly, kind of deliberation, where you get out of more knowledge or other knowledge, and that can be also knowledge about other threats. But that's for me something new to try out. But a lot of methodologies.
Well, I mean, from my experience, I would say that this topic is something that needs to be experimented with. I mean, it goes along with your idea of assembly, which is one, common, one form of commons, instant commons thing. But all these things have to be located, situated within the common that created them in order to really understand them, and then also other threats might be observed and emerge in the new form of command that you are researching. And that's true. The command itself can be a research tool.
Yeah. Yeah, I believe in that. Also, to add to that, I think most of the research what is organized now at universities, etc., is totally not based on commons. Maybe afterwards they try to share the results of research in a commoning way sometimes, but do it from the starting point to say what are relevant research questions, for example. Nowadays it's completely not organized in a commons way, and that's for me a very interesting step also to think about. So.